They swore to fulfill a role, but forgot to align their feelings. 2 years later, he discovers a heartbreaking truth, and everything changes. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel. We post daily, continuing. Helen Smith and Raphael Montgomery Albright's wedding took place on a sunny October afternoon in the grand ballroom of one of London's most traditional clubs. Everything was impeccable, white orchids adorning each table, the choir singing classical pieces, guests dressed with the typical elegance of London's high society. To any inattentive observer, it was the perfect celebration of a loving couple. But behind the rehearsed smiles and champagne flutes raised in a toast, there was only a cold agreement sealed between two families, a social contract disguised as matrimony. Raphael Montgomery Albright, heir to one of the country's most influential families in the banking sector, had accepted the union as one would sign another important document, with seriousness, responsibility, and a complete absence of emotion. Tall, with an athletic build and striking features, he attracted attention wherever he went. At 35, he had built his own reputation as one of the most competent and ruthless lawyers in corporate law, known for never losing a case. The marriage was just another strategy to strengthen alliances and appease his family's constant questioning about his personal life. Helen Smith, 28, never imagined she would be there, at that altar, marrying a man she barely knew. Born in the outskirts of Brighton, the daughter of a housekeeper who worked for years at the Albright family's summer home, Helen had earned a scholarship and graduated with distinction in nursing. It was during a charity event at the hospital where she worked that she met Raphael. The casual encounter transformed, months later, into an arrangement proposed by Raphael's mother, Mrs. Eleanor, who saw in Helen the perfect solution for what she called her son's image problem. A dedicated and good-natured wife who knows her place and understands the value of discretion, were the exact words Mrs. Eleanor used when proposing the agreement to Helen, offering in return the specialized medical treatment her mother, Mrs. Teresa, urgently needed to fight aggressive cancer. It would be an arrangement that would benefit everyone, the Albright matriarch assured, with that smile that never reached her eyes. And so, without declarations of love or promises of eternal happiness, Raphael and Helen became husband and wife before the law and society. The agreement was simple: 2 years of marriage, respectful cohabitation, strategic public appearances, and then a discreet separation that would not tarnish the name of either party involved. In the months that followed the ceremony, they settled in an elegant penthouse in Belgravia, one of London's most exclusive neighborhoods. The 400-square-meter apartment, decorated with designer pieces and artworks selected by a renowned decorator, looked more like a showroom than a home. And that was exactly what it was: a perfect setting for maintaining appearances. Each occupied a wing of the immense apartment. Raphael was absorbed in his cases, meetings, and strategic social commitments. He left early and returned late, often just to change clothes and go out again. He maintained a discreet affair with Danielle Bennett, a university colleague for whom he had always harbored a special interest. The extramarital relationship was not exactly a secret. After all, fidelity had never been a clause in that matrimonial contract. Helen, for her part, divided her life between work at the hospital and caring for her mother, who was responding well to specialized treatment at one of the country's top oncology clinics. In the mansion, she busied herself keeping everything in perfect order, not out of obligation, but because organization brought her some sense of control over a life she had not chosen. Her interactions with Raphael were limited to brief greetings, formal conversations about social engagements, and occasionally messages left on the refrigerator door. There was dignity in the way Helen conducted her part of the agreement. She never complained, never made demands, behaved with the discretion expected of her. In the eyes of society, she was the perfect wife, beautiful, educated, helpful, and always smiling at events. The Albright family's innermost circles, she was seen as that simple girl who got lucky, a comment Mrs. Eleanor never bothered to correct. The balance of that calculated coexistence began to falter when, on a rainy Friday in May, Raphael received a call that would change the course of their agreement. His father, Edward Albright, had suffered a heart attack while at his estate in the Cotswolds. It wasn't serious, but it served as a warning. The doctor recommended rest and a drastic change in lifestyle. "Your father wants to spend some time with you two," Mrs. Eleanor announced, over the phone with that tone that brooked no argument. "I believe the city environment, close to good doctors and family, will be more suitable for his recovery." Raphael did not object. Despite the formal relationship he maintained with his father, an austere man who had always expected nothing but excellence and perfection from him, he felt a deep respect for him. The news, however, meant a change in the dynamics of that house. For the first time, he and Helen would, in fact, need to live as a married couple. "My father will be staying with us for a few months," he communicated during one of the rare dinners where both were present. "He arrives next week. We'll need to make some adjustments." Helen assented, as she always did to Raphael's communications. But, internally, she felt a chill down her spine. Edward Albright was not just the patriarch of one of London's most powerful families, he was also an observant, perceptive man who valued authenticity above all else. How would they maintain the charade under the watchful eye of that man? "I'll have to move into your room," Raphael continued, avoiding looking directly at her. "My father wouldn't understand other arrangements." And so, almost 10 months after their wedding, Raphael and Helen would, in fact, begin to share the same intimate space. The master bedroom, until then Raphael's exclusive territory, had to be adapted. Clothes were reallocated, personal products organized side by side in the immense marble bathroom, a silent routine established. On the first night, lying in the same king-size bed, they stayed at opposite ends, as if an invisible line demarcated territories. The silence was heavy, awkward. It was Helen who finally broke it. "Your father, does he know about our agreement?" "No," Raphael replied, staring at the ceiling. "My mother thought it best to spare him this kind of arrangement. He's from another generation, has more traditional values." "I understand," she murmured, turning to the opposite side. "I'll be discreet, as always." Edward's arrival the following week completely transformed the dynamics of that house. At 68, he still maintained the imposing stature that intimidated executives in boardroom meetings. His gray hair, always impeccably combed, and his penetrating gaze gave him an aura of natural authority. But the recent health scare had revealed a fragility he strove to hide. "This place needs life," he declared at the first dinner, looking around the impeccable but cold dining room. "Houses that are too perfect give me the impression that no one really lives in them." In the days that followed, Edward became a constant presence in that previously silent space. He woke early, insisted on having breakfast with his daughter-in-law, asked questions about her work, her family, her dreams. Initially wary, Helen gradually began to appreciate her father-in-law's company. There was a sincerity in his interest, an absence of judgment she had never experienced with other members of the Albright family. For Raphael, his father's presence at home meant readjusting his life completely. He could no longer maintain his meetings with Danielle. He had to come home earlier, participate in family dinners, feign an intimacy with Helen that had never existed. At first, he viewed it all as a temporary inconvenience, another necessary act to maintain appearances. But something unexpected began to happen. On the nights when the three dined together, Raphael observed with growing curiosity the way Helen interacted with his father. There was a naturalness in her kindness, an authenticity in her interest that intrigued him. She didn't treat Edward as the powerful Albright patriarch, but as a man who deserved attention and care. And to his surprise, his father seemed to flourish under that genuine attention. "Your wife is extraordinary," Edward commented one evening when they were alone in the study. "She has a strength rarely seen in the circles we inhabit." Raphael merely nodded, uncomfortable with the comment. He had never thought of Helen in those terms. In fact, he had barely thought of her, beyond her role in the agreement they had established. It was on a Sunday morning when he woke up and found Helen and his father in the kitchen preparing an elaborate breakfast together that something began to shift within him. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back in an unpretentious bun, and she was laughing at something his father said. A genuine laugh, one she had never directed at him. For an instant, he saw her as she truly was. Not just a piece of an agreement, but a complex woman with an inner life he had never bothered to get to know. "Join us," Edward invited, noticing his son's presence. "Helen is teaching me how to make that cornmeal cake your grandmother used to make. It seems we have a talented chef in the family." Family? The word echoed in Raphael's mind with a strange dissonance. This wasn't a family. It was a commercial arrangement, a social contract with an expiry date. But, sitting at the kitchen table, tasting the coffee Helen had prepared exactly as he liked it, how did she know that? Listening to his father tell stories of his youth he had never shared before, Raphael felt something he couldn't name. A kind of yearning, a curiosity about what it would be like if all of this were real. The breaking point came a few weeks later. Edward had insisted on taking his daughter-in-law to see the National Gallery, his favorite museum in the city. Raphael, busy with an important case, declined the invitation. Hours later, he received an alarming call. His father had felt unwell during the outing, and Helen had taken him directly to the hospital. When he arrived at the emergency room, he found her in the corridor, pale and visibly shaken. Without thinking, he took her hands in his, the first genuine contact they had since their wedding day. "What happened?" he asked, with an urgency that surprised them both. "He suddenly fainted," she explained, her voice trembling. "We were looking at an exhibition when he went pale and collapsed. I thought it was another heart attack." The vulnerability in her gaze awakened a protective instinct in Raphael that he didn't know he possessed. Without thinking, he hugged her. A brief, awkward, but real embrace. When the doctor finally appeared to inform them that Edward had only suffered a drop in blood pressure and would be fine after some tests, both sighed with relief. But something had changed between them. An invisible barrier had been broken. That night, in the silence of the bedroom, Raphael did something he had never done before. He initiated a conversation that wasn't about social engagements or appearances to maintain. "Thank you for taking care of my father today," he said, lying beside her in the darkness. "It was important to me." Helen remained silent for a few moments, as if pondering the sincerity of those words. "He's a good man," she finally replied. "Different from what I imagined." "Different how?" "More human," she explained, her voice soft in the dim light. "When I agreed to this arrangement, I imagined your whole family would be like your mother, calculating cold, concerned only with appearances. Your father is authentic. There's kindness in him." The words hit Raphael in an unexpected way. Was that how she saw him too? As an extension of his mother's calculating coldness? The idea deeply bothered him. "Not all Albrights are the same," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "No," Helen agreed, turning to face him for the first time in that conversation. "I'm starting to realize that." Something in the way she looked at him, a mixture of curiosity and challenge, awakened in Raphael an acute awareness of all the layers of protection he had built around himself. For a moment, he wished she could see beyond them, to know the man behind the name, the position, the agreement that bound them. But just as the thought arose, he pushed it away. There was no room for vulnerabilities in that arrangement. What Raphael didn't know was that at that very moment, Helen was also fighting against her own walls. For months, she had held firm in her decision not to get emotionally involved, to fulfill her part of the agreement with dignity, but without giving her heart. However, the forced cohabitation of the past few weeks had revealed a Raphael she didn't know, a man who, despite his apparent coldness, showed genuine care for his father, a sharp intelligence in dinner-table conversations, and occasionally a subtle sense of humor that caught her by surprise. Neither of them admitted it, but something was changing in that Belgravia penthouse, something that wasn't foreseen in the contract they had signed. June arrived, bringing with it the traditional midsummer festivals that Edward so appreciated. To Raphael's surprise, his father suggested they organize a small celebration in the penthouse. Nothing too elaborate, he assured. Just a few close friends, good food, music, like we used to do at the estate when you were a child. Raphael hesitated. The idea of opening the doors of his home, that carefully maintained setting, for an informal event, made him uncomfortable. But before he could respond, Helen spoke up. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said, with a genuine enthusiasm she rarely showed. "I can prepare some traditional dishes my mother taught me. No one makes a corn cake like Mrs. Teresa." The smile Edward gave his daughter-in-law was one of pure satisfaction, and Raphael, observing that exchange, felt strangely divided between his discomfort with the situation and a growing curiosity about this side of Helen he had never seen before. In the days leading up to the party, the penthouse transformed. Helen, with renewed energy, coordinated every detail, the colorful bunting, the checkered tablecloths, the wildflower arrangements. Edward followed everything with evident pleasure, offering suggestions, sharing memories, actively participating in a way Raphael had never seen him do at formal family events. Raphael himself, initially reluctant, gradually found himself drawn into that atmosphere of preparation. One afternoon, returning early from the office, he found Helen in the kitchen, focused on preparing sweets for the party. Without much thought, he offered to help. The astonishment on her face at his gesture was almost comical. "You can cook?" she asked, clearly surprised. "Not exactly," he admitted, with a half-smile he rarely displayed. "But I can follow instructions, if they're not too complicated." For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side in the spacious kitchen. Helen taught him how to roll chocolate fudge balls with the right amount of pressure, to check the consistency of the pumpkin jam, to decorate the donut holes with cinnamon and sugar. There was an unpretentious intimacy in that shared activity, an absence of the tension that usually hung between them. When Edward entered the kitchen and found them like that, Raphael with flour on his face, Helen laughing at his clumsy attempt to shape the sweets, his eyes lit up with a satisfaction that went beyond words. "Now this is a home," he commented, more to himself than to them. And at that moment, for a brief instant, he wasn't wrong. The night of the party arrived, bringing with it a different energy to that usually so controlled apartment. Close friends of Edward, some of Raphael's colleagues, and, to his surprise, 2 of Helen's friends from the hospital, Marcella and Julia, made up the small crowd circulating through the space decorated with vibrant colors and cozy lights. Raphael watched, with growing fascination, how Helen moved naturally among the guests. There was none of the nervousness or insecurity she displayed at formal high society events. Here, in an environment she herself had helped create, she exuded a quiet confidence, an unpretentious charm that drew people into her orbit. "Your wife is charming," commented Charles, one of the senior lawyers from the firm, as they watched Helen serve punch to a group of guests. "I've never seen her so at ease." Raphael nodded, not quite knowing how to respond. The truth was, he had never seen her like this either. Radiant, spontaneous, completely present. It was like discovering an entirely new person inhabiting the body of the one he had shared a home with for almost a year. The party was in full swing when the doorbell rang, announcing a late guest, Raphael, who was passing through. The hall at that moment opened the door without thinking, and froze when he saw who was on the other side. Danielle Bennett, elegant in a red dress that highlighted her curves, displayed a calculated smile on her painted lips. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped forward and kissed Raphael on the cheek, lingering a little longer than would be appropriate. "Surprise," she murmured, in an intimate tone that made his blood run cold. "I heard about the little party and thought it would be fun to show up. I hope I'm not being inconvenient." Before Raphael could react, Edward appeared in the hall, his face immediately hardening as he recognized the visitor. Danielle had always made a point of making her admiration for the Albright patriarch clear, an admiration that had never been reciprocated. "Miss Bennett," Edward greeted, with that polite coldness he reserved for people he didn't approve of. "What an unexpected surprise." "I heard about the party by chance when I ran into Charles at the High Court this afternoon," she explained, with the ease of someone accustomed to navigating complicated social situations. "And since I know how much you appreciate traditions, I thought it would be a good opportunity to finally meet your daughter-in-law. Raphael talks so little about her." The comment, laden with insinuation, made Raphael involuntarily clench his fists. But before he could intervene, Helen appeared behind her father-in-law, bringing with her the sweet aroma of the treats she had just served. "You must be Danielle," she said with surprising tranquility. "Raphael mentioned you worked together on some cases. Welcome to our home." The way Helen emphasized "our" did not go unnoticed by anyone present. There was a firmness in her tone, a subtle but unmistakable territorial assurance. Raphael watched, astonished as his wife, that woman who had always seemed so discreet, so careful not to claim space, now positioned herself as hostess, extending her hand to Danielle with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Danielle accepted the greeting with visible hesitation, clearly disconcerted by the unexpected response. What followed was a masterful display of how to deal with an intruder without ever losing composure. Helen led Danielle to the living room, briefly introduced her to the other guests, and, with the elegance of someone born into that milieu, left her in the care of Marcella, who, sensing the situation, promptly engaged the newcomer in a conversation about the recent exhibition at the Tate Modern. Raphael observed the entire scene with a mixture of astonishment and admiration. He had never imagined Helen could handle such a delicate situation with such poise. When their eyes met across the room, something silent was communicated between them, a mutual understanding, a tacit pact to protect that night, that fragile balance they had built in recent weeks. The party continued without further incident. Danielle, realizing her plan to cause embarrassment had failed, remained politely distant from the host, focusing on socializing with the other guests. She left early, with an excuse about another engagement, leaving behind only a faint trail of expensive perfume and the veiled promise, whispered to Raphael as she departed, that they would talk soon. When the last guest left, it was already past midnight. Edward, tired but visibly satisfied, retired to his room after a long embrace with his daughter-in-law. "It was a perfect evening," he declared with that direct sincerity that was his hallmark. "You brought life to this house, Helen, and that is worth more than all the Albrights imagine." Alone in the living room, amidst the remnants of the party, Raphael and Helen began to reorganize the space in a silence that, for the first time, was not uncomfortable. There was a natural cadence to their movements, as if they had been accustomed to working together for years. It was Raphael who finally broke the silence. Thank you, he said, as he collected empty glasses. For the way you handled Danielle, it wasn't necessary. Helen continued folding a tablecloth carefully, without looking at him. Your personal life is none of my concern, she replied with a calm that did not reveal her true feelings. But this house, this night, your father's health, all of this matters to me. I wouldn't let anyone ruin what we've built here. The choice of words, what we've built, struck Raphael in a way he didn't expect. Indeed, in recent weeks they had built something together. Not a marriage in the traditional sense, but a coexistence that was gradually becoming more authentic, more comfortable. There's nothing between Danielle and me, he stated, feeling a sudden need to clarify that point. Not anymore. Not since my father came to live with us. Helen finally raised her eyes to meet his, and there was a complex mixture of emotions Raphael couldn't fully decipher. You don't owe me explanations, she said softly. Our agreement didn't include fidelity. I know, he replied, taking a step toward her. But things have changed, haven't they? The question hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. For a moment it seemed Helen would answer. Her lips parted slightly. Her eyes revealed a flash of vulnerability. But then, as if waking from a trance, she took a step back. It's late, she declared, visibly recomposing herself. We should sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day. Raphael didn't insist. He had learned in recent weeks to respect Helen's cautious pace, not to push when she raised her walls. But as he followed her toward the bedroom, he felt a growing certainty that the agreement that had bound them no longer defined what was between them. What exactly bound them now, however, was a question neither of them was ready to formulate. In the following weeks, something subtle but undeniable began to change in their dynamic. They were small gestures, fleeting moments of connection that, in isolation, might seem insignificant, but which combined created a new pattern of intimacy. Helen started leaving coffee ready for Raphael before leaving for the hospital. He, in turn, began returning home earlier, often bringing flowers. For the dining table, he would say, as if needing to justify the gesture. They dined together almost every night, with or without Edward's presence, and their conversations, once so formal and limited, gradually became more personal, more genuine. On a particularly warm July afternoon, Edward insisted they all go to Hyde Park. The doctor recommended light walks, he argued, with that twinkle in his eye that suggested there was more behind the request than health concerns. Strolling along the shaded paths of the park, watching Edward feed the ducks with an almost childlike joy, Raphael and Helen walked side by side, in a comfortable silence occasionally broken by comments about the beauty of the day, the exhibition in the nearby pavilion, the memories the place evoked. It was when Edward, under the pretext of wanting to see a distant sculpture more closely, moved away, leaving them alone near the lake, that the conversation took a more personal turn. My father seems younger every day, Raphael commented, observing the patriarch's figure, walking energetically a few yards ahead. I think he's found a new purpose, Helen replied with a soft smile. Sometimes all we need is to feel that we matter to someone. The profound simplicity of that observation made Raphael look at her with renewed interest. Is that what you believe? That our purpose comes from mattering to others? Helen reflected for a moment, her eyes fixed on the rippling surface of the lake. I think our purpose is more complex than that, she finally said. But mattering to someone, truly mattering, is a good start to discovering who we are. And who are you, Helen? The question escaped his lips before he could stop it. Beyond the dedicated nurse, the devoted daughter, the wife who accepted this agreement. The look she gave him then was filled with a contained sadness that hit him like a physical blow. "There was a time when I would have known how to answer that question," she murmured. "Before all of this, I had certainties, dreams, very clear plans. Now—" She let the sentence die, shrugging her shoulders slightly. Raphael felt an overwhelming urge to touch her face, to brush away a strand of hair that the wind stubbornly kept blowing over her eyes. He restrained himself, uncertain if the gesture would be welcome. "Perhaps we can discover it together," he suggested, in a tone so low that she had to lean closer to hear him. "Who we are beyond the roles we chose, or that were imposed on us." For a moment, something flickered in Helen's eyes, a spark of hope, perhaps, or recognition. But before she could respond, the moment was interrupted by Edward's return, excitedly recounting a casual encounter with an old friend near the sculpture. Back at the apartment, that unfinished conversation hung between them like a suspended promise, a door ajar to unexplored territory. That night, as they lay side by side in the bed they now truly shared, not just as an act, the space between their bodies seemed simultaneously too vast and insufficient. It was the next morning that the delicate balance they had been building suffered its first major shakeup. Helen received a call from the hospital while preparing breakfast. Her face visibly paled as she listened to the person on the other end of the line. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she finally said, hanging up the phone with trembling hands. "What happened?" Raphael asked, entering the kitchen at that moment and immediately noticing her agitation. "My mother," she replied, already moving quickly to grab her bag and keys. "She had a relapse overnight. She's in the ICU. Without thinking, Raphael grabbed his car keys. "I'll drive you," he declared in a tone that brooked no argument. "You're not in a condition to drive." The drive to the hospital was made in tense silence, broken only by Helen's occasional instructions on which way to go. Raphael watched, out of the corner of his eye, the way she kept her hands tightly clasped in her lap, as if trying to physically contain the anxiety that clearly consumed her. At the hospital, reality hit them with brutal clarity. Mrs. Teresa had suffered respiratory collapse during the night. Her cancer, seemingly under control for months, had spread to her lungs. The prognosis was not good. "How long?" Helen asked the doctor, with a controlled strength in her voice that Raphael deeply admired. "Difficult to say precisely," the specialist replied, with the compassionate frankness of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. "Weeks, maybe a month or 2. If she responds well to the new treatment regimen." Raphael observed how Helen received that information. The brief rigidity in her posture, the slight tremor in her jaw, the quick blink to hold back tears that threatened to fall. And then, like an instant metamorphosis, he saw her assume the role of a health professional, asking technical questions, discussing treatment options, taking meticulous notes. It was only when they finally entered the ICU room, where Mrs. Teresa slept, connected to various monitors and tubes, that Helen's facade began to crack. Raphael saw, with a pang in his chest, how she approached the bed with hesitant steps, how her hands trembled as she gently touched her mother's arm. "I'm here, Mum," she murmured, leaning down to kiss the unconscious woman's forehead. "I'll take care of you." At that moment, Raphael felt like an intruder witnessing a moment too sacred for strange eyes. He took a step toward the door, intending to give her privacy, but Helen looked up and fixed him with an intensity that paralyzed him. "Stay!" she pleaded, in a whisper that was almost a plea. "Please!" And he stayed. He pulled a chair close to the bed, opposite Helen, and sat in silence, offering the only thing he knew how to give at that moment: his presence. Hours passed like this, in a silent vigil interrupted only by nurses who came to check monitors, adjust medications. Raphael observed how Helen interacted with them, professional, attentive, asking precise questions. It was another side of her he had never seen before. The competent nurse, respected by her colleagues, completely in her element in an environment that was a vital part of her identity. It was late afternoon when Mrs. Teresa finally awoke for a few moments that Raphael witnessed the purest expression of love he had ever seen. Helen, leaning over the bed, held her mother's hand in hers, murmuring words of comfort in her ear, smiling through tears as the older woman recognized her with a faint squeeze of her fingers. "My girl," Mrs. Teresa whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. Her eyes, momentarily lucid, moved until they found Raphael, standing a few steps behind her daughter. A slight frown, a silent question. "This is Raphael, Mum," Helen introduced, following her mother's gaze. "My husband." The word, husband, echoed in the room with a weight Raphael had never felt before. It wasn't just a title, a legal designation. In Helen's voice at that moment, it carried a meaning that transcended the agreement they had established. Mrs. Teresa feebly extended her free hand towards him, a gesture that caught him off guard. Without hesitation, Raphael approached and gently took it in his. "Take care of her," the woman requested in a whisper that required visible effort. "She is stronger than she thinks, but she needs someone who sees that." "I see," Raphael responded, with a sincerity that surprised him. "I see who she is." A slight smile touched Mrs. Teresa's parched lips before her eyes closed again, exhausted by the brief moment of consciousness. On the way back home, a different silence hung between them, no longer tense, but laden with unexpressed meanings, with crossed emotional boundaries, with a mutual understanding that had deepened in those shared hours of vulnerability. "Thank you for today," Helen finally said, when they were already close to the apartment. "For staying, for being there." Raphael kept his eyes on the road, but his voice revealed contained emotion when he replied, "It's what we do for each other, being present when it matters." The simplicity of that statement hung between them like a newly discovered truth. It was no longer about the agreement, about appearances, about what they owed each other. It was about choices, the choice to be present, to see the other in all their complexity, to offer support without expectations. That night, for the first time since they began sharing the room, Raphael reached across the space they always kept between them in bed. His fingers found Helen's in the darkness, a light touch, almost hesitant, a silent question. After a moment that seemed to stretch into an eternity, she intertwined her fingers with his, answering that unasked question with a simplicity that said everything. There were no more words. They weren't needed. Something fundamental had changed between them. A mutual understanding that went beyond conventions, agreements, social expectations. A connection neither of them had sought, but which now, unexpectedly, seemed more real than anything in their carefully constructed lives. The news arrived on a gray August morning. Danielle Bennett had been appointed a judge of the High Court of Justice. The announcement, published in the official Gazette and widely circulated in the city's legal circles, was met with a mixture of surprise and skepticism by professional colleagues. At 36, it was a meteoric rise for someone with her experience. But for those who knew the Bennett family's connections and their historical influence in the judiciary, the move seemed predictably calculated. For Raphael, the news brought an unexpected relief. The appointment meant that Danielle would now be in a position that would make any personal approach between them not only inappropriate but ethically questionable. It was the definitive closing of a chapter he already considered concluded, but which still hovered like a shadow over his new reality. "Does this change things for you?" Edward asked during breakfast, after casually mentioning the news circulating in his WhatsApp groups. Raphael noticed Helen's attentive gaze. She was preparing scrambled eggs on the stove, seemingly focused on the task but clearly tuned into the conversation. "No," he replied, with a sincerity that surprised himself. "Danielle and I have a past, it's true, but that's all it is, past." Helen placed the plate of eggs on the table with controlled movements, showing no reaction to his words. In recent weeks, since the day at the hospital, something had changed between them. A cautious rapprochement, a growing intimacy expressed in small gestures, meaningful glances, hands that sought each other in the darkness of the room. But nothing had been said explicitly, no formal declaration that redefined the terms of their relationship. "Pasts have a habit of resurfacing when we least expect them," Edward commented, with that casual wisdom that seemed increasingly frequent in his observations. "The question is how we deal with them when they reappear." Raphael nodded, pensive. His father, who had arrived frail from illness months ago, now seemed revitalized, more present and perceptive than ever. The week spent living with Helen, observing the couple's dynamic, had awakened in him a sensitivity Raphael had never associated with the austere figure who had dominated his childhood. "Some pasts need to be confronted," Raphael finally said. "Others, simply acknowledged for what they were and left behind." Helen poured herself coffee, deliberately avoiding his gaze. There was a subtle tension in her movements, a restraint that Raphael had learned to recognize as a sign that something was bothering her. "And what category does Danielle occupy?" she asked suddenly, surprising both Raphael and Edward with the frankness of the question. A momentary silence fell over the table. Raphael studied Helen's face, noticing nuances in her expression that would have previously gone unnoticed. The slight contraction in her jaw, the way she held the cup with excessive force, the thinly disguised vulnerability in her eyes that refused to meet his. "She is a past I have already left behind," Raphael replied, keeping his gaze fixed on Helen even as she continued to avoid his. "Long before you imagine." Something in the tone of his voice, in the intensity of his gaze, made Helen finally look at him. What she saw there seemed to reassure her, as the tension in her shoulders visibly relaxed. Edward, observing the silent exchange between them, smiled into his coffee like someone who had just confirmed a long-held suspicion. The conversation moved on after that moment, but something had been communicated there. A mutual recognition that the emotional terrain between them was changing, evolving into something neither of them had foreseen when they signed that contract of convenience. That afternoon, Raphael returned to the apartment earlier than usual. He found Helen on the balcony, absorbed in a book, enjoying the rare rays of sunshine that broke through the persistent clouds of that London winter. There was a serenity in her posture, an unpretentious beauty that struck him with an almost physical force. It wasn't just her appearance, always elegant in its simplicity, but something deeper, an inner quality he had taken too long to perceive. "Any news about your mother?" he asked, joining her on the balcony. Helen carefully marked the page of her book before replying. "The doctor called an hour ago. She's responding well to the new medication. They've managed to stabilize her enough to consider the possibility of discharge next week." The news was good, but there was an underlying concern in her voice that Raphael immediately picked up on. "But," he prompted gently. Helen let out a deep sigh, letting go a little of the composure she always maintained. "She'll need intensive care, 24-hour nursing, specific equipment. It's a significant cost." Raphael nodded, immediately understanding the concern. Mrs. Teresa's oncology treatment, guaranteed as part of the initial agreement with the Albright family, covered hospitalization and medication, but not necessarily home care after discharge. "That won't be a problem," he declared, with a firmness that left no room for discussion. "I'll arrange everything necessary." Helen stared at him with an intensity that almost made him recoil. "Why?" she asked, in a tone that mixed genuine curiosity and a hint of distrust. "Why would you do that? The initial agreement has already been fulfilled. Your mother guaranteed the best possible treatment, as promised. This would be beyond what was agreed." The question hit Raphael with the force of a revelation. He realized, with sudden clarity, that Helen still saw everything between them through the lens of that initial agreement. A contract of convenience, an exchange of favors. And how could it be otherwise? He had never explicitly stated that his feelings had changed, that his actions were now motivated by something much deeper than obligation. "I'm not doing this because of the agreement," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "I'm doing this because I care. About your mother, about you, about what we've built here." Helen placed the book on the side table, her eyes never leaving his. "And what exactly have we built, Raphael?" she asked with a rare vulnerability in her voice. "Because sometimes I wonder if we are building the same thing, or if I'm just seeing what I wish to see." The implicit admission that there was something she wished to see between them made Raphael's heart race. He took a step toward her, closing the space between them, both physically and emotionally. "What do you wish to see, Helen?" he asked, his voice little more than a whisper. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening, announcing the arrival of Edward, returning from his medical appointment. Helen took a step back, the moment of vulnerability instantly replaced by her usual composure. "We should prepare dinner," she said, brushing past Raphael with a slight touch of arms that seemed accidental, but which sent a shiver down his spine. "Your father looks tired." The interrupted conversation on the balcony remained suspended between them in the days that followed. An unanswered question, an incomplete admission. Both seemed to orbit around that moment of near revelation, simultaneously eager and fearful of resuming it. It was the news of Mrs. Teresa's discharge that finally precipitated a definitive change in their dynamic. As he had promised, Raphael provided everything: a specialized nursing team, state-of-the-art medical equipment, adaptations to the small apartment where the lady lived. Helen, divided between the hospital, her mother's apartment, and the penthouse in Belgravia, seemed to stretch beyond her limits. Raphael watched with growing concern how she visibly lost weight, how the dark circles under her eyes deepened, how her smiles became increasingly rare. "You need to rest," he insisted one night when he found her asleep on the sofa, still dressed, clearly exhausted after a long day divided between the hospital and her mother's apartment. Helen slowly opened her eyes, disoriented for a moment. "What time is it?" she asked, sitting up with visible effort. "Almost midnight," he replied, sitting beside her on the sofa. "You need to take care of yourself, too. There's no point getting sick trying to take care of everyone." There was a genuine concern in his voice that Helen couldn't ignore. For a moment, her usual resistance to any display of weakness seemed to crumble. Silent tears began to stream down her face, to Raphael's astonishment, as he had never seen her cry before. "I'm so tired," she admitted in a broken whisper. "So tired of being strong all the time." Raphael's heart tightened at that rare, precious vulnerability. Without thinking, he extended his arms, offering wordless comfort. And to his surprise, Helen didn't hesitate. She leaned into him, allowing herself to be embraced, to be supported for the first time since that whole storm had begun. They stayed like that for a long moment, her fragile body against his, her tears silently wetting his shirt, their breaths gradually synchronizing. Raphael stroked her hair with a tenderness he had never shown before, murmuring words of comfort in her ear. "You don't have to carry everything alone," he said, when her sobs finally began to subside. "I'm here, not just out of obligation, not because of an agreement. I'm here because I want to be, because I care about you, because—" He hesitated, unsure if he was ready to name the feeling that had been growing within him for months, that had taken hold of his heart when he least expected it. Helen lifted her face to look at him, her eyes still bright with tears, but with a clarity that left him breathless. "Because," she prompted, in a whisper that was almost a plea. "Because I love you," he finally completed, the words escaping like a truth too long, contained. Not as part of an agreement, not as a wife of convenience, but as you are, strong, compassionate, resilient, complex. I love you, Helen, and I'm afraid it's too late to say it." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into an eternity. Helen watched him with an expression he couldn't fully decipher. Surprise, certainly. But there was something more there, something that made his heart clench with apprehension. "I don't know if I can believe that," she finally said, pulling away slightly, creating a small space between them. "I don't know if I can trust what I'm feeling, what you're feeling. We started all of this as a charade, Raphael. How can I be sure that we're not just confusing gratitude, convenience, familiarity with love?" The question was fair, painfully fair. Raphael felt the weight of all their history. The cold agreement, the months of distance, the parallel relationship he had maintained with Danielle, the slow and gradual rapprochement that had only happened due to external circumstances. How could he prove that what he felt now was real, genuine, not just a product of forced cohabitation? "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, deciding that absolute honesty was the only possible approach. "I don't know how to prove that what I feel is real. I only know that it is. I know that I wake up thinking about you, that I worry about your well-being more than my own, that I admire your strength, your dignity, your capacity to love. I know that I want to be by your side not because we signed a paper, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." He took her hands in his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm not asking you to say you feel the same. I'm just asking for a chance to show, day after day, that what I feel is true. A chance to build something real on the foundations of something that started as a charade." Helen watched him, her eyes reflecting an internal battle he could only imagine. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm but soft. "I need time," she said. "Time to understand what I feel, to separate what is real from what is a consequence of circumstances. I can give you that chance you ask for, Raphael, but I need you to understand that I'm protecting my heart. It's been broken before, and I don't know if it would survive another disappointment." Raphael nodded, feeling simultaneously hope and apprehension. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was a door ajar, an invitation to prove, through actions and not just words, that his intentions were sincere. "Time is something we have," he replied, allowing himself a small smile. "Our original agreement was for 2 years, remember? We still have a few months ahead." The comment elicited a reluctant smile from Helen, the first genuine smile he had seen on her face in weeks. "True," she agreed. "Technically, you're still under contract." The lightness of the moment, the small shared joke, seemed to dissipate some of the tension between them. That night, as they lay side by side in bed, the space between their bodies seemed simultaneously too vast and insufficient. But there was an implicit promise in that silence, a possibility that hadn't existed before. The following weeks brought a new dynamic to their relationship. Raphael, determined to demonstrate the sincerity of his feelings, found small ways to show Helen that he was present, that he cared, that his commitment went beyond contractual obligations. He reorganized his schedule at the office to accompany her on visits to Mrs. Teresa. He hired an additional domestic support team to ensure Helen could rest when she was home. He left small, encouraging notes in places where he knew she would find them. These were not grand gestures or dramatic declarations. They were constant, consistent demonstrations of care and attention. Helen, in turn, gradually began to lower her defenses. She stopped viewing his every gesture with suspicion, constantly questioning his motivations. She allowed herself, little by little, to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, something true could be born from the ashes of that convenience agreement. Edward observed the evolution of the relationship with an interest he didn't bother to disguise. His health improvements were remarkable, and doctors attributed much of his recovery to the positive family environment. On a particularly pleasant afternoon, as the three enjoyed tea on the balcony, the Albright patriarch made an unexpected announcement. "I'm thinking of returning to the estate in the Cotswolds next week," he declared, carefully observing the reactions of his son and daughter-in-law. "The doctors say I'm well enough not to need to be so close to the hospital anymore, and to be honest, I miss the countryside, the open space." Raphael and Helen exchanged quick glances. Edward's presence had been, inadvertently, the catalyst that brought them closer. His departure would mean a return to a privacy they hadn't had in months, and an opportunity for them to finally define what they were to each other without the constant presence of a witness. "Are you sure, Father?" Raphael asked, genuinely concerned. "Wouldn't it be better to wait a few more weeks?" Edward smiled with that perceptiveness that seemed increasingly sharp. "Son," he said, gently placing his cup on the table, "I believe my presence here has already served its purpose, perhaps even more than I initially imagined." The comment, laden with implicit meaning, made Helen blush slightly. Edward turned to her, his gaze softening. "When I came here, I found two people living under the same roof but separated by invisible walls. Now, I see a couple learning to build bridges. My presence is no longer necessary for that process." The frankness of the observation caught both of them off guard. It was the first time anyone had explicitly named the transformation that had occurred between them in recent months. "Besides," Edward continued with a mischievous twinkle in his eye, "I believe you two deserve some privacy to discover what you truly feel for each other without an old busybody watching every move." "You were never an intruder," Helen protested, genuinely affectionate. "Your presence here changed everything for the better." Edward smiled, extending his hand to briefly touch hers. "And that's precisely why I know it's time to leave," he replied softly. "The best changes are those that continue even when their catalyst is no longer present." On the day of Edward's departure, a week later, the apartment seemed strangely empty despite its vastness. Raphael and Helen accompanied him to the car that would take him to the estate, bidding farewell with long hugs and promises of frequent visits. When the vehicle finally disappeared around the bend in the road, they remained standing at the building's entrance, suddenly aware that they were, for the first time in months, truly alone. "It feels strange, doesn't it?" Helen commented, as they went back up to the apartment. "As if a part of the house left with him." Raphael nodded, feeling the same sense of emptiness. "I guess we got used to being three," he replied, watching how the evening light bathed her face in golden tones. "Now we'll have to learn to be two again." The implicit question hung in the air. What kind of two would they be now? Still a couple of convenience, united by a social contract and an agreement of appearances? Or something more, something that had grown organically between them, nourished by unexpected circumstances? That night, after a silent dinner, Helen found Raphael on the balcony, contemplating the city lights that were beginning to twinkle on the London horizon. There was something different about her, a determination in her posture, a clarity in her gaze that he hadn't seen before. "I have something to tell you," she said, joining him at the railing. "Something I should have said a long time ago." Raphael felt a tightness in his chest, uncertain what to expect. "Before I met you, Before I accepted the agreement proposed by your mother, I was engaged," Helen revealed, her eyes fixed on the distant city lights, as if it were easier to speak without looking directly at him. "Marcus was a doctor at the same hospital where I worked. We had been together for 3 years. We had just bought a small apartment. We were planning the wedding for the end of that year." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "When my mother fell ill, when it became clear that the treatment she needed was beyond our financial means, I became desperate. Marcus suggested we sell the apartment, take out loans. But even then, it wouldn't be enough. That's when Mrs. Eleanor came with her proposal." Raphael listened in silence, feeling the weight of each word, finally understanding why Helen had always seemed so resigned to a loveless marriage. She had left behind a true relationship out of filial duty, out of desperation. "I told Marcus about the proposal," she continued, her voice now softer, laden with old pain. "I thought he would understand, that he would support me. But his reaction was different from what I expected. He said I was selling myself, that it was a form of prostitution, that if I went ahead with it, he would never look at me again." Her hands trembled slightly on the railing. Raphael resisted the urge to touch them, feeling that she needed to complete her story without interruption. "In the end, I chose my mother. I signed the agreement. I became Mrs. Albright, and Marcus kept his promise. He never spoke to me again, blocked my number, requested a transfer to another hospital. He disappeared from my life as if the 3 years together had never existed." Finally, she turned to face Raphael, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "When you said you loved me a few weeks ago, I was terrified. Not because I don't feel anything for you, but because I'm afraid. Afraid to trust, to believe, to allow myself to feel something that can be taken from me again." Raphael felt his heart expand with an emotion almost painful in its intensity. That confession explained so many things: Helen's reserve, her reluctance to form bonds, the dignity with which she had endured months of a marriage of appearances. She had already given her heart once and had it broken not by lack of love, but by an impossible choice between love and duty. "When I said I needed time," she continued, "it wasn't just to understand what I feel for you. It was also to find the courage to risk again, to believe that something that started as an agreement could transform into something true." Raphael took a step toward her, cautious, still respecting the space she seemed to need. "And now?" he asked, his voice little more than a whisper. "Have you found that courage?" Helen gazed at him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his face, in his eyes. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find, for a small smile began to form on her lips. "I think so," she replied softly. "I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe when you held my hand at the hospital, or when I saw how you treated your father with a care that defied everything I thought I knew about you, or perhaps when you hired that additional nurse for my mother without me asking, just because you realized I was exhausted." She took a step toward him, closing the distance between them. "What I know is that, at some point over these months, you stopped being the man I married for an agreement and became the man I'm falling in love with a little more each day." The words, simple and sincere, hit Raphael like a wave of warmth. Unable to restrain himself any longer, he closed the remaining distance between them and took her face in his hands, with a delicacy that contrasted with the intensity of his emotion. "May I kiss you?" he asked, in a husky whisper. "Not as part of an act, not to maintain appearances, but because it's all I've wanted to do for months." Helen's smile widened, her eyes reflecting a mixture of vulnerability and determination that left him breathless. "Yes," she replied simply. The kiss that followed was not like the formal touch of lips they had shared at the altar before an audience of indifferent guests. It was a meeting of souls that had traveled a long road of distrust and distance to finally recognize each other, accept each other, desire each other. It was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if both feared that the reality of the moment might dissolve if they moved too fast. But soon it deepened, laden with all the contained desire, all the unspoken words, all the feelings that had grown silently between them. When they finally pulled away, breathless, they remained with their foreheads touching, their breaths mingling, their hands intertwined, as if afraid to lose each other again. "I think we just violated the terms of our agreement," Raphael murmured, with a smile that lit up his usually serious eyes. "There was no clause about falling in love." Helen laughed, a light, free sound that filled the space between them with a joy neither of them had ever experienced before in that house. "Your father was right," she commented, caressing his face with light, feathery fingers. "We really did need privacy to discover what we truly feel." That night, as they lay together in the bed they had shared for months without truly sharing, there were no more imaginary lines dividing territories, no more safe distance to be maintained. There were just two people rediscovering themselves, revealing themselves to each other not just physically but emotionally, with all the scars, insecurities, and hopes they carried. Making love for the first time was like finally coming home after a long journey. There was urgency in their touches, yes, but also a tenderness, a reverence that transformed the act into something almost sacred. Every kiss, every caress seemed to say what words couldn't yet fully express. "I am here, I am present. I choose you not out of obligation, but out of desire, out of admiration, out of love." Afterward, nestled in each other's arms, they talked as never before, about childhoods, abandoned dreams, secret hopes. Helen told him about her mother raising her alone after her father abandoned them, about the financial difficulties, about the determination that led her to win a scholarship, to graduate with distinction, to build a respectable career despite all obstacles. Raphael spoke about the constant pressure of being the Albright heir, about his mother's calculating coldness, about how he had always felt his worth was tied to what he could achieve, never to who he truly was. He confessed how his relationship with Danielle had been, in large part, a form of rebellion against his family's expectations. She had never been approved by Mrs. Eleanor, never fit the mold of what a proper wife should be. Ironically, he reflected, tracing invisible patterns on Helen's bare back, my mother ended up choosing for me exactly the person I needed, albeit for the wrong reasons. Helen lifted her face to look at him, a playful glint in her eyes. "Are you saying your mother inadvertently did us a favor?" Raphael chuckled, kissing her lightly. "Never tell her that. Her ego is already big enough." The playful remark brought up a question they hadn't yet discussed. What would happen when the deadline stipulated in the original agreement came to an end? When the charade they had agreed to maintain was no longer necessary? As if reading his thoughts, Helen suddenly became serious. "What will we do when the 2 years are up?" she asked, the vulnerability evident in her voice. Raphael pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. "Whatever we want to do," he replied with a conviction that surprised them both. "We can renew our vows, if you wish. This time not out of obligation, but out of choice. We can move somewhere else, start fresh away from the shadows of the past. Or we can simply continue day after day, building something real on the foundations of what started as a charade." He pulled back slightly so he could look into her eyes, so she would see the sincerity in his next words. "What matters is that, from now on, it will be our choice. Not a contract, not an obligation, not an agreement between families, just the two of us, deciding together what we want for our lives. Helen smiled, her eyes bright with an emotion she finally wasn't trying to hide. "I like the idea of choosing you," she said softly. "Every day, choosing you." The next morning, they woke up intertwined, as if their bodies had sought each other during sleep, refusing to maintain the distance that had for so long been their norm. The London sun, finally breaking through the persistent winter clouds, bathed the room in a golden light that seemed to symbolize the new beginning unfolding before them. Raphael watched Helen sleeping peacefully in his arms, her hair spread on the pillow, the serene expression she rarely displayed when awake. He felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude for the unexpected path life had taken, for the agreement he had reluctantly accepted, for the illness that had brought his father to his home, for every small circumstance that, combined, had led them to this moment. They married out of obligation, for an agreement, for convenience. But they discovered, in the process, something no contract could foresee or guarantee. They discovered love. A love born not of immediate passion or instant attraction, but built patiently, daily, through respect, mutual discovery, and conscious choice. A love that, having grown slowly, had roots deep enough to withstand the storms that would surely come. When Helen finally opened her eyes and smiled at him, an open, luminous, unreserved smile, Raphael knew with absolute certainty the agreement was over, the contract was fulfilled. What they had now was infinitely more valuable, more real, more lasting than any social arrangement could be. They had found, in the most unlikely place, the most precious of treasures, a true love, born from the ashes of a charade.